Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Arena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rav Yosef Halevi Weinberg, Olav Shalom, Rav Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz, Olav Shalom, Rav Yael HaKohen Khan, Olav Shalom, and is in schus and merit of Rav Zev Yecheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz, Le'edich Yom B'Shanim Tevis, for many long, healthy years. So we began chapter 6 in Tanya, which in a way mirrors and parallels the previous 3 chapters, 2, 3, 4, and 5, previous 4 chapters, I should say, which talk about the Nefesh Elikis, the divine soul. Zelu Umazeh, says the Alter Rebbe, which means that now you have, God has made one opposite another. He made a mirror world, a parallel world, that we also have, just like the Nefesh Elikis, the divine soul, we also have an animal soul. But not just a general soul. Just as the divine soul is klula, me'eses sfiris kadeshis, encompasses and is comprised of 10 holy spheres, basically 10 building blocks, what we call the 10 faculties, umisabeshes, b'shleish levushim kadeshim, and it manifests and gets dressed and clothed in 3 sacred or holy garments, both, he says the word kadeshim, and before Kadeshes, because we're talking about the divine soul. So too, Kach, and here's the Zeluma, Kach HaNefesh, the Sitra Achra, so too the Nefesh from the other side, otherwise known as the animal soul, is also comprised of, and from the Sitra Achra, Meklipas Nega, that comes from Klipas Nega, as we explained what Klipas Nega is, from the Klippa, from the transparent, or from the bright klippa, meaning it's a klippa, it's now manifest as something that's not purely divine, in a husk, in a shell, but it's not completely negative either. So that's the other soul, from the other side, and that nefesh is hamlubeshes bedama adam, which is enclosed and in the dama adam, in the blood of the person, as we'll learn later in chapter 9, that's where the animal soul is primarily driven by the emotions of the heart. And as he also said at the end of chapter 1, so that too, this is the end of the sentence, the phrase, Klula me'esa kisrin de misavusa. It's also comprised of the 10 powers, of the 10 kisrin, the 10 crowns of impurity. So it's also 10, corresponding to the 10 faculties. But this time we don't call it Esses Spheres Agdashis. Before he called it Esses Spheres Gudashis, the 10 holy spheres. And now he's calling it the opposite of holy, Klippa. This is Kisin de Misavusa, crowns of impurity. Misavusa is like Tuma, impurity. So now we have and the second half will be into the 10 crowns. We explained why it's called crown. I'll go over that in a moment. And then a few lines later, he's going to say, and also in 3 garments, in the 3 garments that are also not pure garments, thought, speech, and action. But right now we're focusing on the faculties. And because he first wants to explain what are the 10 faculties of the animal soul, and how are they different than the 10 faculties of the divine soul. And then he's going to move on to the garment. So why is it called ksarim? Before he called it sfiris. So sfira essentially means, in the language of Chassidus, eidus in kelim, a commensurate joining and fusion, a merging of an energy and a container. In simple English, for example, the letters on a page are the containers. The ideas they convey is the energy, is the oir. I'm speaking now, the words you hear from my mouth are containers, and they contain an energy, the ideas that are being conveyed. And a healthy and proper communication they're proportionate to each other. They're commensurate to each other, like tailored for each other. They become seamless. As soon as you're reading and something is wrong, the writer is not a good writer, or the speaker is not speaking in an intelligent way, or in a coherent way, you're going to feel a tension between the two. So it's critical, Eidus and Keim. Same thing like in the faculties of the human being. Talk about the blood inside our blood vessels. When everything is healthy, thank God, it flows almost seamlessly, completely seamlessly. If God forbid you feel something, or there's some type of blockage, that's not good. The same thing, the vision in your eye, the hearing in your hair. So that's a hislapshus, what's called in Chassidus, Eidus bekelim mamalakol almin. And that's a sphera. A sphera consists of that combination of energy and container. Electricity flowing properly into an appliance. Not too much and not too little. When you say keser, keser means a crown. A crown is removed from the thing that it is dressed upon. The keser is above the head. It's not in the head. It's not like the moyach sheberesh. The brain inside, the mind inside your brain is pnimi. That's what I'm referring to, mamal kalam, an immanent energy, an immanent faculty. A keser is called a makif. It's there, but it's somewhat removed from the thing that it is relating to. So keser could be lemal yusa, could be a positive thing. Say keser of Atzilus. The Ratzon of Hashem, Ratzon is the contrast to the faculties. Ratzon doesn't have a particular keser. Where's your desire? Where's your will? In which part of your body? It's everywhere. Whatever you want. You want to use your mind, you want to walk, you want to talk, you want to eat. Whatever it is that you're doing, you need Ratzon. Ratzon is a makif. So L'mal Yus, in a positive way, we talk about Ratzon as keser. It's removed because it's like above. It's like the commander. It's commanding. You can have a powerful mind and the brain is functioning, but you need the Ratzon desire to want to use your mind and now go sit down and learn something. And the same thing with the other immanent faculties. So you need we'll call it the transcendent faculty of desire. That's in a positive way. But then there's also the other way around. Kisrin, the world of Toyu, which is not Tikkun, is sometimes referred to the spheres are like Ksorim. What's a keser? Means the energy is there, but it's not quite commensurate and tailored and fitting perfectly into its container. So there's a tension. So in the negative sense, when we say kisrin, the misavusa, why we call it crowns? Because the energy is somewhat outside of the actual entity. Now, why is that the case? Because it's impurity. What does impurity mean in simple psychological terms? There's a sense of self. Once you have ego, once you have self-interest, and it's not purely divine, so when there's pure divinity, there's a seamless flow. It's a healthy relationship between the creation and the creator, between the energy and the container. But when there isn't a seamless flow, why? Because the container now is an identity of its own. Here I am. Imagine the letters of the page have their own personality. They're not necessarily interested in being a channel, and a seamless channel at that, for the energy within them. Just using as an analogy. Then you have yourself a dissonance going on. So that's why it's called Kisin de Misavusa, because now you have the animal soul. In that, the divine soul, everything is aligned to the divine, as we learned at length. It's a chelik elikam mal mamish, comes from chachmasa yizbarach. What is it? It's a divine energy. It's rooted in the very essence of the divine, and it continuously flows. What does that mean, divine? That it's completely aligned to what God wants. The divine soul on its own doesn't have any other agenda. And then it manifests. How does it manifest? Through its faculties. Moichin and midas. And what are the moichin and midas? What is the intellect, the cognitive and the emotional of the divine? All aligned with what God wants. And then the garments as well. The garments of thought, speech, and action. Torah and mitzvahs, as we learned at length in chapters 4 and 5. To the point that we become completely unified with the divine through our Torah and mitzvahs. Especially Torah, learning Torah, as explained in chapter 5. Now we're talking about the animal soul. The animal soul, as the name implies, an animal has its own agenda. What is its own agenda? Survival. Me. My first interest is me, not God. Not God-centric, egocentric. Now this doesn't necessarily mean yet evil. Doesn't mean necessarily doing something destructive, but you've already moved away, so-called off the reservation, so to speak, where it's not pure seamlessness of Eidus and Kelim. It's now a form of Keser. So the energy is there, but it's somewhat a little removed. Because remember, the animal soul is also created by God. It's also a divine creation, just like all of existence. But in the world of Yesh, in the world where existence has its own independent consciousness, and it's not just a channel for the divine purpose, then you have somewhat of a little detachment, if you wish, a dissonance. And that's why it's called the crowns of impurity. But they're still zelo mazeh. Meaning, yes, it's true, their personality is different, but it's still equal to the divine soul that has 10 faculties. The animal soul also has 10 faculties. They're being directed in different ways we're going to be discussing. And what are they? So just as we learned with the 10 spheres Gudeshis of the divine soul, they consist of 2 categories, the cognitive and the emotional. So too here, continuing where we left, we're continuing where we what we learned last week. Shein Sheva Midas Royis. They're the 7 emotional midas, but they calls them now Royis, negative emotional faculties, which Habois Marba Yuseidas Royim, which originate from the 4 negative elements, Aniskorim Le'il, that was mentioned and explained in the end of chapter 1 in Tanya earlier. So why does he bring both these? Because he wants to show that their personality is very different. Their emotions too, but an emotion that's a selfish emotion. And based on, and originating from the 4 negative elements. Like he explained there, fire leading to anger, and the other negative characteristics. It's a stark contrast to the divine faculties, which are all driven by the divine, to contemplate on the greatness of God and have love and reverence of God. In other words, it's a complete seamless connection. Here we're talking about already your own emotions, your own interests and impulses. So the Sheva Midas Rois Abois Marba Yuseidas Haroim, V'Seichel Hamelidon. That accounts for the 7 midas. What about the other 3? Remember, if the animal soul only has 7, then it's not zelu mazet, it's not parallel. It also has to have the other 3. So v'seichel hamelidon hanechlak l'sholish. And the seichel, the intellect, which produces these emotions, hamelidon means give birth to. We'll discuss that shortly. But it's divided into 3. Shehein chochma bina v'das. Chochma bina and das. Chochma as in conceiving, and bina in cognition or comprehension, and das recognition or internalizing, even though here it's not going to be internalized as we'll discuss shortly, which are mokir hamidus, the source of the emotions. So there you have the parallel. Now it's interesting when you compare the language here in chapter 6 to the language in chapter 3, where he talks about the faculties, you see quite a few differences. As the Rabbi, especially the Rebbe Rashab in his commentary in Tanya explains. Firstly, the most obvious one, he begins with the Sheva Midas. He starts with the emotions and then goes to the intellect. There's the other direction. We talked about another distinction where here he says the Seichel Hamelidon and Mokar Midas. There he says that the Midas are Teildos Chabad. They're the children, the offspring of Chabad. Even though you could think, one second, Melidon isn't Melidon giving birth, but there's a distinction in the language. There, Das plays a tremendous role, especially the end of chapter 3. The iskashus, the binding, the complete commitment and complete intimate connection with the ideas you're contemplating on. And he says, Dafka that gives birth. So though he mentions Das here, but he doesn't emphasize that the Das the way it is in chapter 3. He also uses the word Hanechlak l'shalish, and there he says Kolol m'shalish. So all these differences all indicate that yes, they're parallel worlds, Zeh Umazeh, and therefore there's an equal battle because both sides, so to speak, the divine soul and animal soul have equal faculties, but their faculties are very different types. And each one of these words has a different element to it. So we discussed some of them last week. I'll go over it briefly because it's so vital in understanding the anatomy as we dissect the animal soul, especially in contrast and comparison to the divine soul. So, the first is, why does it start with the Midas? Very simple. Go to chapter 9 in Tanya, and he says clearly that where does the animal soul reside? In the heart. the left side of the heart where there's the blood. Because its personality is the impulses. It's impulsive. Emotions are impulsive. If we did not have a mind to check and reflect and evaluate, we would be completely driven by the impulses of the heart. Even as it is, impulsive behavior is so much part of our lives. You see something, you're drawn to it. Your mind can say, 1 second, maybe it's not healthy for you. But what is an animal like? We say nefesh habahamis, animal soul. And for an animal, this is not a bad thing. It's the human being that where it becomes a challenge. An animal was not created to sit and contemplate about God. An animal was created to be utilitarian, to serve a function. Whatever animal it may be. Some of the function we understand, some of it is in the mysterious design of existence. And that's why you see an animal is completely, totally focused on its existence. First of all, feeding, eating, breeding, caring for its young, hunting if it's an animal that hunts. Every animal has its personality. And that's what it does 24/7. Everything is around its survival. Now, that's the way an animal was created. So if an animal is hungry, there's no reasoning with it. What's driving it? It's emotions. The emotion. But as we'll learn in a moment, that doesn't mean there's no intellect at work. It just means the intellect is essentially secondary to the emotional impulse. So an animal is hungry, it sees something that it wants to eat. There's nothing that's going to stop it. Yes, you can control it, but the animal on its own, an outside force can control it. The animal on its own has no choice. So therefore the midas are the driving force. The same thing with the animal soul. Though we're going to learn later that we have the ability of discipline and refraining and controlling and harnessing, but on its own, left on its own accord the way God created it, it's an impulsive creature, it's an impulsive soul, which means it's an emotional force that has intelligence that helps the emotions. Like in an animal, it also uses intelligence to hunt, to protect its young. It'll be even creative and innovative. About what? However, not about God, not about higher reality, not about something that's transcendent, but about its survival. So there's also an intelligence. There are people who live their lives very intelligently, but it's all about me. And they intelligently figure out how to satisfy their selfish desires. So it's not there's no intellect. So the first thing begins with the Sheva Midas. And he wants to make the case that it's not that we're wired that way. It's coming from 4 elementary particles, or 4 fundamental elements, I should say, which means it's part of the very nature of this entity. This is not giving us an excuse why we can behave. It's just telling us that identity, as I said, the anatomy, the personality. So that's the first thing. When it comes to the divine soul, it's the other way around. The most important thing is intellect, is the mind. Because the divine soul does not follow impulses. The divine soul is trying to understand how it fulfills its purpose in life, not its own survival. And for that, the mind was given to us. And the mind itself, especially Chachma, is connected, as we learned, Chuch v'Chachma se'echad, is connected with the Elokus itself. The Chachma is Bittel, the Midas is Yesh, and Meichen is Bittel, especially the Chachma. Like later in chapter 35, we'll say in the Hagah, in the gloss, that there you feel, Hu levade ve'ein zulose, he alone, God alone, and nothing else. Because Chachma is not focused on self. It's focused on trying to experiencing a reality higher than us. The mind explores beyond our subjective instincts or impulses, our subjective interests. And the mind, therefore, is contemplating on God, as we learn. So it begins with conceiving, Chachma, Bina, comprehending, Das, intimately connecting, in order to what? To awaken and stimulate and arouse a divine emotion, the emotions to the divine, love and reverence, or reverence and love, toward the divine. A very different agenda. So there he begins with Moich. Says the Rebbe Rashab, what do you mean? Doesn't the divine soul also have natural emotions? So first of all, he's meaning the natural love it has for God. We learn later in Tanya, in chapter 18 and 19, that there's a natural love. So first of all, he said that natural love comes after, it's revealed after we reveal the love that comes through and the reverence that comes through contemplation. And second of all, that also needs moichin. Explains. In other words, it's not just impulsive. It's true. It's a natural impulse of the divine soul to connect. But the main focus of the divine soul is doing it deliberately, not just its natural inclination. And that's why we have the whole Aveda of contemplating with our Meichin, and then it gives until this Meichin. So the midas of the divine soul are primarily a offspring of the divine mind. That's what it's about. So that's why there it is what is Teildes Chabad. Here he says Seichel Hamelidon, because the intellect does, because at the end of the day, when an animal, for example, is looking at prey or at food, its mind is seeing it. It's drawn to it emotionally, but its mind is necessary. It has to see it, it has to think about it, and if the animal had no mind at all, it wouldn't even know how to move. It wouldn't know where to move. It wouldn't be able to even figure out how to gain what its emotions are, but what its emotions are drawn to. But the emotions are the driving force. And in the divine soul, what's the driving force is the will and the connection to want to experience something beyond us. And that comes through a mind, intellect, contemplating and giving birth to emotions. And again, we're not talking about the very wiring of the divine soul. We're talking about its primary preoccupation. And the primary preoccupation of the divine soul is constantly trying to connect to God. The primary preoccupation of the animal soul is to try to survive and try to exist and to connect to yourself and actualize your own desires. So there is Seichel HaMelidam. They divide also the Chachma Bina Das. There's also Das. But as the Rebbe Rashab, he brings in his explanation that Das, to look in Kehelis Yaakov, which is a sefer of Kabbalah, that collects, it's like an encyclopedic in Aleph Bey's order on different topics. So it says in Klippah there's also Das, but not like the Das of Kedusha. Chapter 3, if you look there, he says Das is the kashrus, the intimacy where you're becoming one with the divine idea that you're learning or contemplating on. Here, Das exists. There's a certain element of Das, of connection, but nothing close to the way it is in Kedusha. Because here the focus is not the connection to the divine that's being contemplated on. Here it's all about the survival and existence of the entity itself. And then he says, Mokar Hamidus. And this is the Mokar Hamidus. Instead of the words that he used before, Teildes Chabad. For the reasons I just explained. I also explained last week why he says Nechlak, Hanechlak l'shalish, and not Kolol, because once you're dealing with your own agenda, it's Ischalkus. It's more about your own fragmented interests. It's not united in a cohesive whole, fused, Eris and Kalim, like we spoke earlier, toward the divine purpose. There it's kolol, it's encompassed. Nechlak indicates on separation, on different agendas, which is what happens when you're in the world of Yesh. You're not looking for unity. Yeshus, materialism divides, spirituality unites. The divine soul focused on its spiritual transcendence and focused on spiritual growth is in a unified state. And here it's Nechlak. But now let's continue learning as he explains, what does this mean, Mokar Hamidus? Since there is an intellect at work as well, what's going on? So he explains. So even though visceral emotions, like we said, impulsive or visceral emotions is at the core and the essence of the animal soul, to say it as devoid of intellect, absolutely not. Because even a pleasure-seeking impulse also has a mind. Either a mind that reminds you that this is something enjoyable, or a mind that helps you figure out how to gain what you're looking for. So impulses is a driving force. As a matter of fact, most problems in life would be resolved if people would say, what's driving you? And people will say, no, I'm just objectively looking for something. It's not true. Bribery, bias, blinds even the eyes of the wise, says the Torah. Why is he going to explain, as he explains later in chapter 9 in Tanya? Because just as the blood of the heart feeds and rushes to the mind, the emotions, the impulses can also take control of your mind. Yes, you may dress it up and cover it up and smoke screen it, that it's all about your mind, but it's really a taiva that you have. You have an impulse and you want it, so you use the mind to explain it or justify it or to figure out ways to gain it. If it really came from an objective place, then first you figure out, is this thing even a healthy thing for me? That's why you see so often. It's one thing you can say, you know what, I'm impulsive, I'm emotional, but I'm objective, which of course is a distortion. Then at least, but I'm subjective and that's what I want. Then at least there's an honesty going on. But if a person says, no, I'm objective, but it's truly driven by impulse, so then they're just covering up their impulses. So the fact of the matter is that intellect really is the one that should be driving objectively whether this thing is right to have a desire for. But here we're talking about the seichel is a secondary, is an accessory to the midas. So he explains, Ki hamidis hen lefi erech ha-seichel. Because the emotions are relative to the intellect. So it's not the midas are being driven by the mind. They're lefi erech ha-seichel. In other words, seichel and midas work together. And he gives a very clear example. In other words, a person's desires are going to be commensurate to what their mind is. But commensurate here, not because the mind is telling you what is right and what is wrong, objectively. It's because the mind, each mind, has its own level of maturity. Because a child desires and loves small trivial things. Because his intellect, his mind, is too small and immature to appreciate anything more valuable. So when you see a child, for example, playing with toys, or things that we would consider to be trivial, the mind of the child has not yet developed to a point where it appreciates, let's say, intelligence, or things that are more sublime in nature. Its mind, that's what it enjoys. And because the mind enjoys that, so therefore, like he says, the midas are lefi erech ha-seichel. So what he's drawn to is comparable to his maturity in his mind. But it's not because the mind is telling him what is right and wrong. What's going on here is that the midas are the impulses, but they work hand in hand. That's why you'll see a person who's older. When a person gets older, what happens? The opposite. Because his mind develops, he then also, his emotions are stronger. When I mean to say the emotions not stronger, the emotions are directed to something greater things. He won't like toys. He'll read a book. But it doesn't mean that the midas are not, it's just the midas and the seichel are lefi erech one another. So here you see that the midas need seichel, and the seichel determines in which direction the midas will be focused on. So it's only the difference is the object of the desire is different, not the very desire itself. And it's the mind. And the same thing, v'chein miskayis u'miskasim medvorim ktanim. Similarly, the child is angered and infuriated by small things. V'chein b'yispaidos v'shar midas. And the same is true with showing off and other negative traits. So he's going through chesed, gvura, tiferes, where you see how each one is commensurate to the seichel. Due to the time limits, we shall stop here. Elaborate more on this in the next class. Everyone have a good week. TanyaApplied.com, where you can find all these programs and ask any questions. Be well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.